What's going on, everybody? Today is October 27th. It is Friday, which means it is Aloha Friday. And we're all participating, as you can see on the screen here. And this is our Friday show. And we almost got everybody here today. We got Beth, we got Robert, Andy, Aaron, and I'm Brian. Looks like Carl's joining us right now. So let's let Carl, maybe he may not be right now. Jimmy's out today, but he'll be back next week. Today, Robert is very excited because we are talking about AI and bias. And not just Robert, everybody's excited about it, but it was his idea to bring this up as a topic. So AI and bias, and God knows there's a lot of different ways and paths we can take this conversation. So I will just stop, kick it over to you, Robert, because maybe you want to kick this thing off. And let's see what
I'm not sure I want to kick it off. I want to see if anybody else has got any definitions they've looked up or any types of ways to describe this category. So before we get into my opinions on it, I'd like to see if there's anybody that would be willing to explain what we are talking about regarding bias. Like even today, I changed the subject line on my LinkedIn. Is it on this one? It says AI and bias, the unseen influence. I put AI and bias, fact or fiction. So I want to.
That does change the topic for sure.
The people who were, it was clickbaity. I was like, but I'd like to get somebody to define what is bias in the context of AI. Go ahead, Andy. Hit me up.
Okay. So let's take a simpler form of AI than generative AI trained on everything that's been written that can be accessed by the trainers. Take an example of a simple predictive AI that takes data that you give it and tries to fit a line to that and say, okay, if these are the data points that you've shown me, then I'm going to predict that given this X variable, I'm going to say this is what the Y variable is likely to be. Now, let's suppose you only give it 50 points in that prediction, and they are not representative of the full range of what the possibilities are. Then it will reliably predict what the points are going to be based on the 50 that you gave it. But the 50 aren't widely representative of all the possible outcomes. So that predictive ML is going to be biased towards your small training set. So how do you repair that? You improve it by increasing the number of training data that you put in there and making sure that they're more widely representative. So that's a simple example of training bias. Now extend that to a large language model that's been given a huge quantity of data in the form of texts, right? And now it's learning in a kind of a mystical fashion how to predict the next words and create really sophisticated language outputs based on this same kind of prediction model. It's not a regression, but it's a deep neural network that's coming up with answers to questions, but it's based only on what it learned from its reading. So a classic, reference to bias that you hear about LLMs is, cultural bias or societal bias, where it's been trained largely with information about, not highly representative of African culture necessarily, because there's a higher weight of information that's in the printed corpus out there, that's the training set, that's about Western societies. So how do you correct that? It's difficult without really studious efforts by the people marshaling the training to include new data points. And one of the ways that you can simply do that is by creating an overweighting of lower represented data. And so if you only have five,
and therein lies the problem.
Yeah, go. So anyway, that I think gives you a pretty good understanding.
There was a very succinct explanation. Yes, I agree. Now, to dumb it down even further, if you're a car salesperson and you sell Hondas and the last three people you sold a Honda to were old ladies, you're going to say, well, old ladies buy Hondas. That's that was a biased assumption based on your very, very small data set, right? Now, my problem, and I love the way you explained it in how data sets can be, the corpus can be non-representative. I get that. That's true. to the example you gave. But other examples I'm worried about. Like there's this thing that Bloomberg put out that, oh, AI does a bad job of representing inmates or doctors or healthcare professionals or you name it, or housekeepers, like, oh, they're this type of skin tone or this type of gender, and it's misrepresentative. And my initial pushback is, well, what's the data actually saying? If the data is saying that 50% of people in medical school are white males, I don't know how else to tell you. But if you're saying doctor from an AI response, like give me a picture of a doctor from an AI, and they know it to be the data is what it is. You can't, well, if you don't like it, I'm sorry, but that's the majority of people. If I were to say to you, majority of give me a picture of an engineer, and it's more than likely of a certain ethnicity, and it's a male, because that's the majority of the people in engineering school. So I don't know how to combat that. I mean, the fact that it's not represented, but it's also true. So, Carl, thoughts?
Sorry, I just saw the comment. Carl has a Aloha hoodie, and no, I do not. I was looking at all of you. You still need to send me that shirt. The thing I have from the generative AI perspective, though, is if you don't like the output, you can change the output. So if something shows you something that you're like, oh, this is not representative within my perspective, I'll just change it. So is the issue the initial, oh, it doesn't represent what it is today? I'm like, okay, you can change it though. So that's where I was like,
yeah, but I think just to argue the other side is that if you take images out, if you're asking it to write a paper or some kind of blog post, and it's not representative of your audience, and it's like, you're constantly able to change it because that's not the gender I wanted, or that's not the group I'm targeting, because it's always assuming that doctors are blank, or So I think that people would rightfully so shouldn't have to constantly be editing it based on what they're looking for. But my argument got back to my side is that, well, that's the majority, and the corpus is based on averages and based on the most likely semantic connection. So you can't.
Yeah, I get your point entirely. It is true that it is a fair, maybe unjust, but it's a fair representation of what the world looks like today. That's societal bias. Let me give you an example. Let's suppose we're automating an analysis of CVs, and we're going to align the CVs with the jobs that we're looking for, and we're going to make a prediction using AI of what the likely job offer ought to be, like the dollar value of the salary offer that we're going to offer them, and we use the actual data. Well, that's going to perpetuate a societal bias that will give a lower estimate of what the likely pay should be for this CV, because the AI can figure out that that's a woman. Okay, somehow it can just get that out of just cues in the CV.
Let's not get into gender pay disparities, because that's a whole nother argument that I'd rather not to get into.
Well, it's not an argument as much as it is just a representation of the realities. So
the realities are some job titles are predominantly women, some job titles are predominantly men. And if we're going to talk about gender disparities, we can do that, but it's not in the context of AI, as I'm trying to say.
I disagree with that. I want to push back a little bit on that, because if what Andy is saying is there's AI being used to sort through, and this has been happening in the government forever and ever and ever. They've used algorithms and things like that to sort through, and you had to know how to put the right keywords in there, and it was filtering people out left and right. But if people are starting to use more language models and algorithms that have bias in them, yeah, I think the subtext is that these models absolutely, without it ever being said on a piece of paper, absolutely are advanced enough to determine probably race, sex,
but you're already making an improper assumption. You just said bias in them. Bias is in the eye of the beholder. Like what are you talking? I mean, bias for one group is not for another. So you can't just say the model is biased, because that's presuming a position of that you have an authority on determining which one is the proper, and none of us can say that it's biased or not biased, quite frankly, because we're always going to have our own bias in looking at the model. Oh, it didn't represent this enough. Go ahead. Beth.
Okay. I think that implies that individually we're doing it all individually, and therefore we're all powerless, but we exist in community, and it is important to also have a community-based perspective. What I want to highlight is what I think is a conflation between the idea of something being an accurate representative and something being a desired representative. So if we look at doctors, one of the things that needs to happen, or ideally happens when you engage a doctor, is that you trust them, right? And if the representations have all been white men, then it is an undesirable outcome that when you encounter a doctor who is not a white man, that you have an innate distrust because it's not what you've been exposed to. And that, I would say, is a reason to move against what is potentially a reality or an accurate, right? Like it's like 53%. It was the stat that I just pulled up of medical school graduates are white. I think it makes sense to have a top-down institution of a wider representation for the greater good of being able to walk in and not have to engage that, like, oh, no, wait, you don't look like the doctor. And I will speak personally. I think doctors look like my age or older. And that's going to stop.
But because we're talking about AI here. That's different. That's a whole nother bag of worms. But if we're talking about AI and bias, that's what I'm trying to get at.
And AI is the intermediary of creating this content, this writing, this. I don't see the distinction that you're seeing. Like, AI is creating content in our lives, right? AI is making algorithmic decisions in our lives
based on reality. Based on the
reality is not necessarily the desired.
The corpus, if the corpus was like only parts of the internet that are dominated by this type of group, then I would agree. But into Andy's point earlier, like if it's a smaller data set, then it's going to produce a less reliable output. But we're getting to the point where it's trillion, it's trained on trillions of parameters. And so it's a little bit harder to make the argument that it's not representative.
I'm not making the argument it's not representative. I'm making the argument that is not the ideal.
Yeah, that's why I use the two terms.
Ideal is eye of the beholder. We can't say ideal. Ideal is, well, hold on. You can't talk about ideal. We're not talking about ideal. We're talking about what it's generating, whether we like it or not. That's between each person's own opinion. But where the society is a whole
distinction. Beth's making the distinction between what I referred to as fair, meaning representative. Like it's fair for the AI to say, that's what the training data says. That's what the enormous corpus of all the information in the world says. But it's not just. Like the world is not just. So we're actually, when we talk about bias, we have to look at, as Beth is suggesting, what's the just outcome, and how can we stop the perpetuation of bias that is unjust?
Such a Pandora's box, though. So if we all agree on this call that it should be X, and then the model makes an adjustment for such, well, then now whoever is in control of that model next makes another adjustment next month, and now we're all pissed. Be careful what you wish for. If you start trying to make those modifications and make it just, or make the justice that could change.
Right, that was the danger, that because it's a slippery slope, and I can hear where you're saying, Robert, is like, if you do one thing one way or another, it's then on who is training these models and how they're training it, will
Right.
then impact everything else. So I think it's, and I hear you, Beth, where as a society there is an ideal in the communities that are in. I think the quagmire we're going to be put into is when these models, when certain groups say, hey, these are not representative of our perspective, our group, we want you to change it, or we're going to pressure, or we're going to train our own models. It's that, and then it goes into all the other divisiveness that we've gone into. So that would be the question. But maybe the solution would be, and there's also dangers with this, is that isn't one of the major goals is to have our own personalized AI system that is reflective of our views and values.
That's
which
equally
then
as dangerous. Yeah.
that is definitely.
Well,
And I think like right there, but if you look at where everything's going, I was like, oh, I have a chatbot that can retrieve my data. It is not very hard to base prompt it on something. Obviously there are guardrails right now, but like an open model, maybe you can do something like that. So it's difficult to say, hey, we got to do it this way, because that has ramifications down on how certain things are, like how those models are trained in a certain way.
And the problem is those models are trained and then they're being adjusted by a very small group of people who are a monoculture of not representative of the nation or world as a whole. That's where we get in trouble. And so, and then you're going to get competing models. You got the white supremacist model over here, and you got the whatever model over here. That's where it gets dangerous. So my angst with bias is that when you start talking about it, the inevitable outcome is I'm going to adjust it based on my sensibility. And that's where it gets scary. That's why I hate bias, because it's the inevitable end of it is we got to make a pivot. We got to make an adjustment. It's like we don't like history, so we're going to make an adjustment on the books of history. We can't do that. History was history. So,
but is it practical to wish, for want of a better word, is it practical to wish that the human race will no longer have bias? Because I just don't think that's ever going to happen, to be honest.
Right.
You know, if you've got two LLMs and you're training them, so you say, okay, I'm going to train one of them on the data from a major like CNN or the New York Times, and I'm going to train another one with a lot of the information in it is going to be trained on Fox News content. They are both going to be biased to their audiences. So the liberal side of it's going to be biased to the liberals, and the conservatives watching that will think it's biased and horrible and hate it, and vice versa. So it is very much in the eye of the beholder. But whether we can get rid of bias, I mean, hell, people still thought COVID was fake. And that when they gave you an injection with the COVID injection, it injected 5G mind control nanites into you. I mean, shit. If we can't get that sorted, we can't sort bias. I don't think.
Well, we would have seen that if you
rabbit hole that we are down. Let's rise.
No. I do have a good point here. I do have a good point here. I'm listening to all of y'all, and I'm staying open minded. And Robert, I hear your point. I think what my fear is right now is, if I don't know what the data is on this, but if I was to somehow get the data from OpenAI for ChatGPT, and it gave me the data of race, age, gender, let's just start there, for who is currently using ChatGPT, who is currently doing thumbs up and thumbs down on ChatGPT, saying, is this data good? Or was this response good? And was this response bad? Now, we can only be human. So we will bring all of our societal biases and upbringings into these answers subconsciously. That is just going to happen, as opposed to maybe a Claude or an from Anthropic. That's a constitutional AI. Right. It is not asking me whether I thought that answer was good or bad. It simply has a constitution, and it does its very best to adhere to that. And it doesn't ask for human intervention to do that beyond that. Now, was that constitutional AI biased to begin with? Perhaps. I don't know. I'm not making assumptions there. I'm just saying my fear right now is that if I was to get this real data from OpenAI, I would imagine that a lot of the people currently using ChatGPT probably look a little similar to me. And that makes me fearful, because if that's all the reinforcement data going back into OpenAI, what does that say about the future of what a response in that? And I'm just picking on that LLM. We could say this for any of them that
that's
have
not how they're getting
reinforcement
their
modeling.
feedback data, though. They're getting it from engineers that they're hiring to do RLHF. So they're not getting it from you and me. But I
What's
hear
the point of
thumbs
me
up
saying
from
yes or no
account.
to the response then? Where is that going?
yeah. Well, that's you're not policing whether it was representative of you. That's not what those thumbs up, thumbs down. That's whether the output was good. But the people that are policing this that we're talking about here, bias, are literally policing that particular thing and adjusting it based on that. That's this trust and safety layers at OpenAI. That's what they've been tasked with.
So
Well, the
why
only
does
other
this
thing I just
matter
want to
to
add to super
business?
quick was just the other point of like on LinkedIn. I see this all the time on LinkedIn, but you can put any social media network on here. And I think we have danger of this with AI, which is that I oftentimes hear people on LinkedIn go, oh, LinkedIn has changed. LinkedIn now keeps showing me political or religious or whatever, or it's all polls or it's all this. It has changed. And my answer is always the same. Hey, guess what? That's an algorithm that's only trying to reflect. LinkedIn is a mirror. Your newsfeed on LinkedIn is a mirror of you. And if you click and like and slow down and look at more, that is exactly what you will get. To assume that Facebook or LinkedIn or TikTok or any of these are identical for any of us, obviously we know this isn't the case because we know Facebook has been fighting this. And, you know, I've heard Mark Zuckerberg talk about that. He's like, if you had told me a decade ago that I would basically be an ethics company that has to go deep into watching for bad intent and bad actors and all those things, he said, I would have thought you were nuts, but here we are. And I don't envy that position to try to do that as much, you know, crap as they get and stuff. I don't envy somebody trying to figure out how to police a Facebook or something like that, because Facebook just wants to show me the feed that I like the most. That's going to keep me on the platform. And I feel like, just to make a correlation, I feel like that's what we're in danger with just AI, the pleasing LLMs, the pies of the world and stuff like that, who just want to make me happy. And what does that mean if I'm biased to begin with? If it just wants me happy, it's just going to reinforce perhaps stereotypes, bad ideas, these kind of things.
Beth, you had a point you were going to make.
I'm just bringing us back to like, so why does this matter to business? Why does it matter that that the LLM that you're using may or may not be biased?
Well, it all comes back to representation, like you mentioned earlier. If the LLM is not outputting what you're looking for it to output based on your agenda, then it's not behaving the way you need it to behave. So, so that it's only in cases where that's part of your importance for your company. Like if I'm writing a blog post about the best butters to use in baking, obviously it's not going to matter, right? But if I'm looking at making a blog post about encouraging young girls to enter engineering and STEM, and I want to give representation and have an article written on that, then I need to make sure it mentions women and it mentions engineering. And so that if the corpus of data is not showing them as much as they're showing men or other ethnic groups, then I'm gonna have to adjust it, as Carl said. I'm gonna have to re-add it. So that's where it comes up at Beth, if I was to force the question. But
and my slight pushback, I think agenda, it may just have been a word that you used, but it implies like a conscious, like I have a purpose. And
no,
I think
just like you're
like
yeah.
unconscious. We're just
I didn't mean agenda like
not
I have
capital A.
like I meant like my agenda, like you do when you're having a phone call. I have an agenda for this phone call, that kind of thing.
Got it.
Whatever.
Well, let me mention that you have to kind of accept the role of the major LLM providers and their attempts to give fair representation to underrepresented groups. But in the context of a company, you can also use examples when you're building prompts, or you can use like a training set of examples that you want to use as good examples of the kinds of employees that you might be looking for. And you have to be aware that when you use examples, those end up being more heavily weighted in the LLM's response than even its own pre-training. So you should be aware that when you provide examples, that you might be, selecting. There's a selection bias when you put the examples in. So that's one area where I think you ought to be careful when you're using it in the corporate context.
Well, honestly, when I was hearing you, I was thinking that's a great way for you to preload the model with your, I hate to say agenda. What's
Your
the word for
desired
agenda?
biases.
With your
right?
whatever your policy is. If you want if your policy is such, then you just preload it so that it behaves the way you want it to. Yeah.
But you might find that you inadvertently selected without attention to gender differences, for example. You inadvertently selected one that's going to be biased against one of the genders. And that may not be what your corporate objective is. I mean, a lot of companies have a declared intent to be fair, despite the facts, right? That women are still somewhere around 75% of compensation for exactly the same position.
Again, we'll go through that later. But if I am trying to, if I'm a bricklayer training school and I'm trying to hire more bricklayers, and I want to make sure that I get more women representatives, I have to specifically make a note because the majority of bricklayers, 90% of them are men, right? So
yeah, but that's not necessarily that they're the best bricklayers, because maybe the best bricklayers are women, and we just don't know it yet.
Yeah.
Oh gosh, man, there's so much to say on this conversation. But Jordan Peterson has a really good quote on that one. So I won't steal.
Well, no, share it with me later. I want to know what the other side's thinking.
As we get to like sort of the key takeaways here, I mean, I'll sort of throw mine in the room, and that's just that, Beth, you said, well, what do businesses need to know? I'm certainly not an expert here. I'm learning with everybody else. What I would say is the very least any organization can do is work with perhaps their own internal DEI, groups that, are perhaps there for this. But just education and awareness is, and wherever you fall on it, I think just having more education, having awareness of it, understanding that, the language models, the AI that you're going to be using as a co-pilot in your business may very well be biased. And again, that goes back to your education, your awareness and decisions, and using your internal resources and other resources to determine whether you feel that's correct or not. I'm not here to say you're right or wrong. I don't have any spot there to do that. But I do think more businesses have to be aware of it, because I do worry about, we had stories years ago, way before this AI boom, about like the Target story. A lot of people know this one about Target sent coupons in the mail to, I believe, if it may be folktale now, but like a teenager who didn't even know she was pregnant yet. But Target knew based on her spending habits up to that point, or her parents didn't know, whatever the case was, it arrived in the mail and caused problems within that family. All right. So that's a small example.
Urban myth.
But if we take it now, we look at something like business and learning management systems and things like that. I do worry about privacy and safety and stuff for employees, because what if that learning management system is so good that it's able to tell maybe your sexual preference or orientation, and it brings that into your learning model because it thinks this is going to be the most exact way to help you with whatever, and it's bringing in examples that perhaps you did not want your employer to know, but the model is just going, hey, I'm just trying to do my very best for what I'm trying to produce forward. That's what you
really hope they don't start going rogue like that. That would be foolish.
I'm just saying that, like, I do worry about it. And I think my whole point to the key takeaway is, I think it just having conversations like this, which are difficult, but having more of them, being open about it, listening to all sides and points, and coming up with, the way individual businesses feel like they need to do it. But not talking about it clearly is not the solution.
I would disagree. I think sometimes not talking about it is the best things. We could focus on business and not on all the other social issues. But, that's a whole nother.
My takeaway here is that this is a sticky conversation expressly because there are both racial and gender biases in our society, and we have to address them somehow in the interest of being compassionate and inclusive of those races and genders who are being biased against. So those are
Well,
valid
let's-
conversations.
I would
Let me
also
just-
say it's
let me just-
arguably.
Uh,
It's worth
I don't know.
discussing,
Anyway,
but I don't want to
cross
say
I
talk.
as
also just
Don't
mentioned
cross
when
talk
we're
in the
talking about
takeaway.
AI
arguably.
and how does AI, apply now to education, then we have a responsibility for the curriculum that is delivered by AI, whether formally or informally. And so it's very important for us not to choose to, throw out lots of real existing elements or segments of society when we deliver information in the educational context.
So my key takeaway is, number one, humans are biased by nature. I don't think we're ever going to change that, short of a miracle. And number two, I think at the end of the day, AI, as it develops, is going to be innately biased to the ways that people use it. You've got an AI design. Classic example: you got ChatGPT, and you've got an AI designed by the Chinese Communist Party. There's going to be some significant differences in the biases there. So I don't know that we're ever going to get rid of that stuff. I imagine the larger commercial companies will try to balance things out. They probably won't always get it right, but at the end of the day, using that old saying of beauty is in the eye of the beholder, well, bias is also in the eye of the beholder. So, they may produce X, I might see it as Y, Robert might see it as A. There's nothing we can do about that. We just have to hope that they get the important stuff right.
I think for me, it's it's more about the first part of this is learning how to use these tools and being aware. And like what Steve says in our comments is that you should read your company's acceptable use policy, but also make sure you're educated on how these models actually work, because there's still a lot of myths out there, right? Not everyone knows that these are just essentially prediction machines. There's a lot of like it's specifically trained to answer this type of question. Like, no, it's not. It's predicting through that corpus of knowledge. So it's really important to have an understanding. And I think that's where I'm still trying to push, is like everybody understand these models and know how they work and use them on a daily basis to then have that thought process on what bias is in that.
Agreed. And I think one of the key, for me, my key takeaway is one of the reasons that this matters is that AI is basically an automation, even if it's not attached to a Zapier, make or respell. But it's important to have questions or at least conversations about what's under the hood in the automation. So, yeah. That's I agree. We are needing to understand what predictive means in this context, right? Because Robert's right. Predictive is like 53% is a pretty good prediction, but not necessarily for a business use case.
And I would agree with you, and I would caution everybody who is on one. Are you willing when it pendulum switches the other direction? Will you be on the same bandwagon when it goes too far the other direction? That's where anytime we give license to things like this, we better be ready for when it gets out of control, and we have to be able to push it back the other direction. Like the people that are managing these models, they're monocultures, and they could very well push me and Brian and Andy and Aaron to the fringe with never being able to, and everybody's, it's due. It's, we've white men have been over for, it doesn't matter. The point is that it will be so biased that nobody will be represented, and so we got to be careful with trying to control them. I don't know the solution, but I do know it's better if it's as representative as the society as a whole, because if you start trying to play with it, then we're in trouble. Like who's the policing that? Who's got the button on the, that's who I don't trust. I don't trust the small group of people in a room that's switching the model around. I don't trust those people. So that's my takeaway.
Yeah, we'll in there. I will just throw on a lighter note. Yes, Jill Richards, I think you should subscribe and listen
100%
to
Jill.
us daily and hang with us while you're walking your dog. I don't know who you are, but thank you, Steve. I think that's
Everybody
awesome.
should listen while walking their dog. This is a great idea.
That's fantastic. So we'll end on that note. This is a really good conversation. Thank you, Robert, for suggesting this. I think it was well needed.
Hey, I love you all. Just so you know, I love you all.
Yeah, no,
we
love
did
that.
too.
Even if we don't agree,
That's what's fun about it.
I love every
That's
one of
what's
you.
fun about it. All right, that wraps up another week of the Daily AI Show. It has been a fantastic one, as always. Thanks to everybody who has shown up in the comments. We've seen a lot this week, so we can see we're growing. We're watching the analytics. We know we're growing on the other platforms as well. So keep coming back and hanging out with us. Bring in your questions, bring in your comments. Whenever we can, we'll throw them up on the screen and discuss them whenever it's possible. And yeah, we got some good topics next week. We're going to be talking about AI automations. We're going to be talking about use cases. We're going to be talking about one that Carl brought up is the gap widening? Why do we have some people who are digging in versus other people seem to be indifferent to AI? And we're even going to talk about a tool that's an automation tool called Respell. So that'll be all coming up next week. Thank you, Camilla. We appreciate you every single time. And we will see you guys next week. That's it. Have a great one. Bye. That helps if I have my banner ready. Bye.
That'll hit the blooper reel.